The stench hit them first, thick and sweet like rotting meat left in summer heat, a smell so overwhelming that the landlord staggered backward and covered his mouth with his sleeve. It was July 1916, and Martin Kresinski had come to the small Hungarian village of Cinkota, just outside Budapest, to prepare a rental property for new tenants. The previous occupant, a tinsmith named Bela Kiss, had gone off to war 2 years earlier, and rumor said he was dead, killed somewhere on the Eastern Front, where the Austro-Hungarian army was bleeding men by the thousands in the Carpathian Mountains. Kresinski had brought along Bela Kiss, the local pharmacist, to help assess what materials might be salvaged from the property. They were looking for reeds, simple construction material, when they found the 7 metal drums stacked in the chamber next to Kiss's workshop. The drums were large, 1 meter long and 50 centimeters wide, sealed airtight with lead. Someone had already loosened the top of one barrel with an axe, and when Kiss pried it open fully, that terrible smell erupted from within like something alive. Inside the drum was a bag sewn shut with careful stitches. When they pulled it out, the weight told them immediately that something was wrong. The bag was heavy, too heavy for gasoline which Kiss had claimed filled these drums, too heavy for anything that should be stored in a tinsmith's workshop. They cut the stitches and the bag fell open to reveal what lay inside. A woman's body, naked and pale, preserved in alcohol that had turned her skin waxy and strange. Her neck bore marks, deep impressions where something had been wrapped tight enough to crush her windpipe. Kiss punctured another barrel with a spike, and more of that death smell poured out along with a lock of blonde hair that drifted free like a ghost. They didn't open any more barrels. They ran for the authorities, their hands shaking, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had discovered in the house of the pleasant tinsmith who had lived among them for more than a decade. Detective Chief Charles Nagy arrived from Budapest within hours of receiving the call. He was a methodical man who had investigated murders before, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited at 8 Kossuth Street in Cinkota. Mrs. Jakubek, Kiss's elderly housekeeper, protested loudly when Nagy ordered his men to open all 7 drums. She insisted that Herr Kiss was a good man, that he would never harm anyone, that this was all some terrible mistake. But Nagy ignored her protests and watched as his officers pried open each sealed container. 7 drums, 7 bodies, all women, all strangled, all preserved in methanol with a precision that suggested someone who understood chemistry, who had taken care to prevent decomposition, who wanted to keep these bodies exactly as they were when death claimed them. But 7 drums were only the beginning of the horror. Mrs. Jakubek, still insisting on Kiss's innocence, mentioned to Nagy that she remembered when the drums had been delivered to the property. There had been more than 7, she said, many more. Nagy ordered a complete search of the grounds, and his men found them buried in the countryside surrounding the house. 17 more drums, each one containing another body in the same state of preservation. In total, 24 corpses. 23 women and 1 man, all naked, all strangled, all drained of blood through puncture wounds in their necks that someone had made with methodical care. The bodies floated in their alcohol graves like specimens in a mad scientist's laboratory, silent testimony to years of murder that no one in Cinkota had suspected. Nagy arrested Mrs. Jakubek immediately, suspecting she must have been an accomplice. How could anyone work in a house where 24 people had been murdered without knowing? But the old woman seemed genuinely horrified, and she told Nagy something that made him reconsider. There was a room in Kiss's house, she said, that he had forbidden her to ever enter, a locked room that she had respected as his private space, assuming it was simply a study or workshop where he didn't want to be disturbed. Nagy ordered the door broken down, and what they found inside was a catalog of murder spanning more than a decade. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with volumes about poison and strangulation, about methods of killing and preserving bodies. A desk held letters, hundreds of them, neatly organized in folders. And there was a photograph album containing pictures of 74 different women, most of them middle-aged, all of them smiling at the camera with expressions of hope and happiness. The letters told a story that made Najee's blood run cold. They dated back to 1903, 13 years before the discovery of the bodies, which meant Kiss had been killing for more than a decade while living as a respected member of the Cinkota community. The correspondence revealed his method with chilling clarity. Kiss had placed advertisements in Budapest newspapers under the alias Hoffman, presenting himself as a lonely widower seeking marriage. "I am a man of means," one advertisement read, "looking for a mature woman of good character and independent means to share my life. No family obligations preferred." The last phrase was crucial, Najee realized. Kiss was specifically targeting women who had no close relatives, no one who would immediately notice or raise alarm when they disappeared. The women who responded to these advertisements poured their hearts out in their letters. They were widows, spinsters, women who had reached middle age without finding husbands, women who had money but were lonely, who wanted companionship and love in a society that offered few options for unmarried females. Kiss wrote back to them with charm and eloquence, discussing books and astrology, sharing his supposed interests in the occult and the stars, making them feel understood and valued. He would arrange to meet them in Budapest, taking them to cafes and restaurants, giving them gifts, courting them with a patience and attention that made them fall in love with him. And all the while he was evaluating them. Did they have money? Did they have relatives who would search for them? Were they vulnerable enough, desperate enough, isolated enough to be perfect victims? Those who passed his criteria received more letters, more attention, more promises. Kiss convinced some to send him money, large sums that they believed were investments in their shared future. One woman sold her profitable dressmaking business, liquidating everything she owned to be with the man who promised her love and security. Her name was Catherine Varga, and police would find her body in one of the drums, strangled like all the others. Two women, their names lost to history, had actually taken Kiss to court for fraud, filing legal proceedings to recover money he had defrauded from them. But before their cases could be heard, both women disappeared. The cases were dismissed when the plaintiffs failed to appear in court. No one thought to search for them. No one suspected that the charming Herr Hoffman from Budapest might have silenced them permanently. But Kiss's story began long before 1903, back in 1877 when he was born in the Hungarian town of Iszak. Little is known about his childhood or what shaped him into the monster he would become. By 1900, at age 23, he had settled in Cinkota and established himself as a tinsmith, a skilled tradesman who worked with metal, who understood how to seal and preserve things. His neighbors found him pleasant enough, though he kept to himself more than most. He was tall and handsome with blonde hair and striking blue eyes, features that made him attractive to women despite his reserved nature. He threw occasional parties at hotels, demonstrating a social side that made him seem normal, integrated into the community rather than the isolated loner that serial killers are often imagined to be. He had an interest in astrology and the occult, subjects that in the early 20th century were considered eccentric but not particularly alarming. In 1912, when Kiss was 35 years old, he married a woman named Marie who was 15 years his junior. They moved into the house on Kossuth Street together, and for a brief time, it seemed Kiss might settle into conventional domesticity. But the marriage lasted barely a year. In February 1912, just weeks after arriving in Cinkota with her new husband, Marie began an affair with a local artist named Paul Bicari. The affair was poorly concealed in a small town where gossip traveled faster than horses. Everyone knew. Everyone pitied Bela Kiss, the cuckolded husband whose young wife had betrayed him with another man. In December 1912, Marie and Paul disappeared. Kiss told his neighbors a plausible story. They had run away together, he said, gone to America or Canada to start a new life far from the scandal and judgment of Cinkota. People felt sorry for Kiss, abandoned by his faithless wife, and they welcomed him back into community activities with sympathy and support. What no one knew, what wouldn't be discovered for another 4 years, was that Marie Kiss and Paul Bicari had never left Cinkota. Their bodies were among the 24 found in the metal drums, the only male victim among the women Kiss would subsequently murder. It seems likely that Kiss killed them in a rage, perhaps catching them together, perhaps planning it methodically after the humiliation of their public affair. However it happened, their deaths marked the true beginning of Kiss's transformation from jealous husband to serial killer. With Marie gone, Kiss hired Mrs. Jakubek as his housekeeper and began his systematic campaign of murder. The Lonely Hearts advertisements started appearing. Women began visiting the house on Kossuth Street, arriving with hope and leaving as corpses sealed in drums. The neighbors noticed the drums accumulating, of course. In a small town, everything is noticed. When enough people had commented on the growing collection of large metal containers, the village constable, a man named Adolf Trauber who considered Kiss a friend, came to ask what they contained. Kiss had his explanation ready. War was coming, he said. Everyone knew it. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was on a collision course with Serbia and Russia, and when the war began, there would be shortages of everything including fuel. He was stockpiling gasoline in the drums, he explained, so that he could continue his business trips to Budapest when rationing began. It was a perfectly plausible explanation in 1913 and early 1914, when war clouds were gathering over Europe and prudent people were indeed stockpiling supplies. Trauber accepted the explanation and reported back to the curious villagers. Kiss is preparing for war, he told them, just being sensible. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, and Europe exploded into the catastrophe that would become known as the Great War. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Germany joined Austria-Hungary. Russia mobilized to support Serbia. France honored its alliance with Russia. Britain entered when Germany invaded Belgium. Within weeks, millions of men were marching to the front, and Bela Kiss was among them. He was conscripted into the 40th Honved Infantry Brigade and sent east to fight Russians in the Carpathian Mountains. Before he left, he entrusted his house and all his possessions to Mrs. Jakubek, making her promise to maintain the property until his return. He even left her money in his will, a gesture that later made police suspect she might have known about the murders. But Mrs. Jakubek appears to have been genuinely innocent, simply a loyal employee who believed her employer was the pleasant, educated gentleman he pretended to be. Kiss went to war, and for 2 years, no one in Cinkota thought much about him or his house or the metal drums that sat in his workshop. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder where men died by the hundreds of thousands in battles that accomplished nothing. The fighting in the Carpathian Mountains was particularly brutal, with soldiers freezing to death in winter campaigns, drowning in spring mud, dying of typhus and cholera in unsanitary trenches. Casualties were so numerous that records were often incomplete or inaccurate. In the spring of 1916, rumors began circulating in Cinkota that Bela Kiss had been killed in action or captured by the Russians. His name had appeared on casualty lists, though whether he was dead or simply missing no one could say for certain. His landlord, believing Kiss was gone and unlikely to return, decided to prepare the house for new tenants, which brought Martin Kresinski and Bela Kiss to the property in July 1916, looking for construction materials and finding instead 7 drums filled with corpses. The discovery set off a frantic investigation. Nagy sent telegrams to the military immediately, ordering them to locate and arrest Bela Kiss if he was still alive. He froze all postal and telegraph communications that might reach Kiss, hoping to prevent accomplices from warning him. He alerted police departments across Hungary and in neighboring countries, distributing descriptions and photographs. But finding one soldier in the chaos of World War I was nearly impossible, especially since Bela Kiss was an extremely common Hungarian name. Kiss means little in Hungarian, and there were hundreds, perhaps thousands of soldiers with that surname serving in the Austro-Hungarian forces. Months passed with no leads. Then, in October 1916, Nagy received a letter from a Serbian hospital stating that a soldier named Bela Kiss was there, recovering from wounds or illness. Nagy rushed to Serbia, traveling through war-torn territory to reach the hospital as quickly as possible. But when he arrived, the patient was gone. In the bed where Kiss had supposedly been lying, investigators found the corpse of another soldier, a man who had died and whose body Kiss had apparently used as a decoy to fake his own death. It was a trick that could only work in the chaos of war, when hospitals were overwhelmed with casualties, when record-keeping was haphazard, when no one had time to verify identities carefully. Kiss had walked out of that hospital, leaving a dead man in his place, and vanished into the turmoil of a continent tearing itself apart. The trail went cold. Nagy continued investigating the murders themselves, identifying victims from the photographs and letters found in Kiss's secret room. Several of the bodies were matched to missing persons reports filed in Budapest. Julian Pashak, who had sued Kiss for fraud, was identified. Catherine Varga, who had sold her dressmaking business, was found in one of the drums. Other women were identified by family members who came forward after news of the discoveries spread through Budapest's newspapers. But many victims remained nameless, women who had been so isolated that no one reported them missing, whose disappearances had been attributed to voluntary departures, or had simply gone unnoticed in a society where people moved frequently and communication was unreliable. The investigation revealed that Kiss had received 174 marriage proposals through his advertisements, had accepted at least 74 of these women, and had murdered at least 24. Where were the others? Had he released them after taking their money? Had they been buried elsewhere? Or had Kiss told the truth about some of his correspondence, actually seeking marriage from some women while planning to murder others? The question of what Kiss did with the blood became an obsession for both investigators and the public. Autopsies revealed that the bodies had been drained, puncture wounds in the necks, suggesting that Kiss had deliberately collected the blood after strangling his victims. No blood was found anywhere on the property or in Kiss's workshop. It hadn't been buried, hadn't been poured down drains, hadn't been discovered despite extensive searches. This absence, combined with the puncture wounds on the necks, gave rise to the nickname that would follow Kiss through history, the Vampire of Cinkota. The press speculated that he had drunk the blood, that he was practicing some form of vampirism or occult ritual that required the consumption of his victim's life force. Others suggested he had used it for darker purposes, perhaps in the astrological or occult practices he was known to study. The truth was probably more prosaic. Kiss may have simply disposed of the blood in ways that left no trace, perhaps pouring it into rivers or spreading it across fields where it would be absorbed. But the vampire legend persisted, fed by the gothic horror of the crimes and the mystery of Kiss's escape. The war ended in November 1918 with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hungary became an independent nation, though one devastated by defeat and facing political chaos. Detective Nagy hoped that with the war over, Kiss might surface, might return to Hungary or be identified wherever he had fled. But the immediate post-war years brought no answers. Europe was in turmoil with borders shifting, governments collapsing, millions of refugees moving across the continent. In this chaos, one man could disappear easily, especially if he had planned ahead and had the intelligence and resources to create a new identity. In 1919, someone claimed to have spotted a man matching Kiss's description in Budapest itself, but the sighting was never confirmed, and the man disappeared before police could investigate. Then, in 1924, 5 years after the war's end, a startling lead emerged from an unexpected source. A soldier in the French Foreign Legion came to his superior officers with a disturbing story. He had been serving alongside another legionnaire, a man named Hoffman, the same alias Kiss had used in his Lonely Hearts advertisements. This Hoffman would sometimes brag about his skill with a garrote, with strangling people efficiently and silently, boasting about techniques and methods in ways that made his comrades uncomfortable. The soldier who reported him claimed Hoffman matched the description of Bela Kiss perfectly, the same height and build, the same blue eyes, the same age. By the time Hungarian police received this information and contacted French authorities, Hoffman had deserted from the Legion and vanished once again. Had it really been Kiss? Or was it simply coincidence, another man with the same alias and similar appearance? The question remained unanswered. The most tantalizing sighting came in 1932, 16 years after Kiss's disappearance from the Serbian hospital. A New York City homicide detective named Henry Oswald, nicknamed Camera Eye for his remarkable ability to remember faces, was walking through Times Square when he spotted a man emerging from the subway station. Oswald later swore under oath that the man was Bela Kiss, aged from the photographs, but unmistakably the same person. Oswald tried to pursue him, tried to push through the crowds of tourists and theater-goers that thronged Times Square even in the Depression years. But by the time he could maneuver closer, the man had disappeared into the human sea. Oswald was convinced enough to launch an investigation, to alert immigration authorities, to search for any records of a Hungarian immigrant matching Kiss's description entering the United States. They found nothing conclusive, though rumors began circulating that Kiss might be working as a janitor in apartment buildings on 6th Avenue. These two led nowhere. Either Kiss had slipped away again, or Oswald had been mistaken, had seen a man who resembled Kiss but was actually someone else entirely. After 1932, the trail went completely cold. No more sightings were reported, or at least none that seemed credible enough to pursue. Bela Kiss disappeared into history, into legend, into the realm of unsolved mysteries where truth blurs with speculation. Was he the man Oswald saw in Times Square? Did he live out his years in New York or some other American city, dying peacefully in old age, his crimes unknown to those around him? Or had he returned to Europe, perhaps to South America, where many European criminals fled after the wars, living under an assumed name until death claimed him? The questions multiply with no answers. If Kiss lived to a normal lifespan, he would have died sometime in the 1950s or 1960s, meaning that anyone who might have known him in his later years is almost certainly dead now. The case is beyond solving through traditional investigation. DNA evidence doesn't exist for victims whose bodies were buried a century ago. Records from World War I are incomplete or destroyed. The people who knew Kiss, who might have recognized him if he appeared in their cities or towns, are all gone. What remains is the horror itself, preserved not in alcohol but in the historical record. 24 people murdered over 13 years by a man who lived among his neighbors as a respected craftsman, who courted women with promises of love and delivered only death, who preserved his victims like trophies in metal drums that he explained away as gasoline storage. The case fascinates because Kiss was never caught, because he escaped justice and disappeared so thoroughly that we don't even know where or when he died. It fascinates because of the vampire legend, the blood drained from bodies and never found, the occult interests and astrological obsessions that suggested darker purposes than simple murder. It fascinates because Kiss was both monster and man, capable of charm and normalcy while concealing depths of cruelty that his neighbors never suspected. The photograph that survives of Bela Kiss, or rather the detailed sketch made from photographs, shows a man in military uniform with a broad face, dark mustache waxed to points, and eyes that seem to stare directly at the viewer with an intensity that transcends the limitations of the medium. Those eyes are unsettling, piercing, containing something fanatical and amused, as if Kiss found his crimes entertaining, as if he was laughing at everyone who failed to recognize what he was. It's easy to project knowledge onto that image, to see the killer in his expression because we know what he did. But his neighbors in Cinkota didn't see it. The women who answered his advertisements didn't see it. Mrs. Jakubek, who worked in his house for years, didn't see it. They saw a pleasant tinsmith, a lonely widower, an educated man with interesting hobbies. They saw what Kiss wanted them to see, which is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his story. In Hungary, Bela Kiss is remembered as the one who got away, as the vampire who escaped justice and vanished into legend. His house on Kossuth Street in Cinkota no longer stands, demolished decades ago, but the location is known and marked in true crime histories. The metal drums themselves were destroyed after the investigation concluded, evidence that no longer needed to be preserved. The bodies were buried in graves that have long since been forgotten, the women's names known only to researchers who dig through old police files and newspaper archives. And somewhere, whether in an unmarked grave in New York or Budapest or Paris or Rio de Janeiro, Bela Kiss lies dead, his final secrets buried with him, his true fate known only to whatever forces govern the afterlife he may have believed in through his occult studies. The case leaves us with uncomfortable questions about how well we know the people around us, about how effectively evil can disguise itself as normalcy, about how many Bela Kisses might exist in the world, people who smile and shake hands and live among us while harboring monstrous natures that no one suspects. It reminds us that not all monsters are caught, that justice is not always served, that sometimes evil simply walks away and disappears, leaving behind only corpses and questions, and the cold comfort that eventually, even if human justice fails, death comes for everyone. Bela Kiss lived free after murdering at least 24 people, possibly far more. He enjoyed whatever years remained to him, whether they were few or many. He died without facing trial, without punishment, without ever paying for what he had done. And that is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of his story, the knowledge that sometimes, despite our best efforts and our deepest need for moral order, the monsters win. They get away. They vanish into darkness. And we are left staring at metal drums and photographs of women who trusted the wrong man, whose hopes for love led them into death, whose bodies were reduced to specimens preserved in alcohol by a killer who treated human life as just another tinsmith's project, something to be manipulated and sealed and stored away. The Vampire of Cinkota remains one of history's unsolved horrors, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, that it sometimes wears a pleasant face and offers marriage to lonely hearts, that it knows how to escape and how to vanish, and that in the end, some mysteries remain mysteries forever.